So the title of this presentation is Stakeholder Engagement Strategies for Policy and Programmatic Uptake, Lessons from the Drivers of Food Choice Competitive Grants Program. Nearly 40% of low-middle income countries are experiencing a double burden of under- and overnutrition. Governments and their partners are attempting to develop multi-sectoral policies and programs to address both the causes and consequences of the double burden, which is highlighting urgent needs for evidence to inform their decision-making. Researchers working on double burden topics, especially those at the interface of ag nutrition and health, are recommended to directly and proactively engage with stakeholders to improve both the relevance of research and facilitate its uptake. But research stakeholders are diverse and may include government officials, civil society, NGOs, donors, the private sector, and communities. From the perspective of the researcher, developing strategies to respond to the unique information needs and communication styles of these diverse groups, and often multiple groups for a single project, can be complicated. The Drivers of Food Choice Competitive Grants Program provides many useful examples of how to develop and implement multi-sectoral and multi-level stakeholder engagement strategies within research projects at this interface of ag nutrition and health. Therefore, the objective of this study was to derive lessons learned around designing and implementing stakeholder engagement strategies from the 15 projects in the DFC portfolio. Data consisted of a document review of research proposals, reports, and other outputs, as well as in-depth interviews with project leads. Data were coded using an a priori code list that was adjusted based on emergent themes. Analysis was inductive and oriented to developing a descriptive catalog of pre-identified and emergent themes on the topic of stakeholder engagement. With respect to results, we grouped engagement strategies into two broad categories, which were unidirectional and bidirectional. Unidirectional strategies were typically used to facilitate the use of evidence in decision-making. So these strategies don't necessarily seek dialogue or input from stakeholders, but are mainly intended to inform. So strategies were both formal and informal means of communication, formal being conference presentations, research briefs, policy briefs, and so on. Informal engagement strategies might include email updates or brief in-person meetings, mainly to apprise or sensitize a stakeholder to a project or its status. So the benefits of this approach is that unidirectional strategies typically require less time, effort, knowledge, and money on the part of the research team to implement. They're useful for raising awareness and generating interest in the study, and thereby increasing buy-in for the results down the line, especially among high-level decision makers. The downside is that unidirectional strategies alone, without additional dialogue and follow-up with key stakeholders, may be insufficient to facilitate uptake. On the other hand, bidirectional strategies were typically used to facilitate stakeholder participation in knowledge production. So stakeholders may be invited to contribute to the research process at certain points, such as in the framing of research questions, the interpretation of results, or the development of policy recommendations. So strategies might include inception and dissemination meetings that were oriented towards soliciting feedback and input. A note on implementation, so judging when to undertake these more participatory exercises and having a clear understanding of how to use the input received are key to making this approach successful. One grantee quoted here noted that feedback from their inception workshop was used to tailor their outputs to the needs of their stakeholders to great success. By the same token, another grantee cautioned that initiating dialogue with stakeholders prematurely, especially around project findings, can hinder the resonance of the message and its uptake among the targeted stakeholders. So benefits of this approach are that bidirectional strategies seem to improve the immediate relevance and applicability of the research and facilitated strong working relationships with in-country stakeholders. The downside is that these are more time, knowledge, and resource intensive to design and implement. The resource constraints and short time frames typical of most research projects may not allow for extensive participatory engagement. Nonetheless, several grantees were able to successfully integrate them into their research programs as key components of the research process. For example, involving stakeholders as research participants or working with them to validate findings. So as we conclude, I want to share a few takeaways. First, stakeholder engagement strategies were tailored to goals for research uptake. Now, these goals were laid out in broad brushstrokes at the proposal stage, although there was typically flexibility to adapt strategies and target audiences as the project proceeded. And so this influenced the mix of strategies that were selected, the timing of engagement, and the frequency of contact with stakeholders during the research process. Second, most grantees used both uni- and bidirectional strategies to achieve their goals for uptake. Third, these findings reinforce that stakeholders should be engaged throughout the research process and not only at dissemination, and this goes for both uni- and bidirectional strategies. Fourth, engagement strategies that sought at least some level of participation from stakeholders seem to yield success in terms of immediate uptake. With respect to the overall purpose and value of stakeholder engagement, one in-country investigator kind of reinforced this point and made this observation from his dual perspective as an in-country decision maker, saying, quote, "We had had experiences which were bad in the past. Researchers would go ahead and design their studies, implement them, come up with findings, and then bring the findings to us to implement. And some of the questions we would pose to the researchers, where were we when these ideas were hatched out?" And so we can conclude that proactive stakeholder engagement helps to foster productive working relationships with in-country stakeholders, helps to align research questions with national priorities and evidence needs, and through all of this enables research uptake in policy and programmatic settings. In order to advance knowledge around best practices for stakeholder engagement in this unique space at the nexus of ag nutrition and health, researchers should systematically document their engagement strategies and the outcomes of these strategies, and share them with others via formal publications in implementation science or evaluation outlets, for example, or through their institutional platforms. Funders should earmark resources for these additional activities as well. I just want to acknowledge our funders and thank the investigators who participated in this effort. Thank you.